Ever had one of those drives where you just feel like things are getting kind of weird, like you're in a movie or something?
Oh, yeah, I know the feeling.
Well, imagine this. You're driving home, lose hours of time, and then under hypnosis, you start remembering being beamed aboard a flying saucer.
Wow, that's a story for the ages.
Sure is.
Yeah.
Tonight, we're diving into the case that pretty much invented the whole alien abduction thing as we know it, the Barney and Betty Hill incident.
Right, and what really grabs you about this case is that it happened way back in 1961 to this regular couple.
Yeah, they seem like totally normal folks, right?
Oh, yeah, totally. Barney and Betty Hill, they were active in their community in New Hampshire, well-respected, involved.
Not exactly the kind of people you picture when you think UFO experiencer, right?
Nope, not at all. Barney even worked for the Postal Service. A&D was on the U.S. Civil Rights Commission.
Wow, so not your stereotypical UFO folks at all.
Ah.
So walk me through that night. I know they were driving back from a vacation. What happened?
They were driving through rural New Hampshire. This was in September of 61, and Betty, she saw this bright light in the sky acting all strange.
Okay, so at first they probably thought it was just a planet or like a super bright star.
Yeah, something like that, but as it got closer, they realized it was way more unusual.
Unusual might be a bit of an understatement. I've read about this case before, and what always gets me is that it wasn't just seeing lights. Something else happened to them, right?
You're right, it wasn't just a sighting. Their clothes were ripped up for no reason, their car had weird markings on it that messed with the compass, and their watches stopped working.
It's those little details that make you think, okay, something really weird happened here.
Exactly. It makes you realize this wasn't just some quick visual thing. Something really impacted them.
And then, of course, there's the big mystery, the missing time.
7 hours gone, just poof, vanished. They tried so hard to figure out what happened during that time, retracing their steps, trying to piece things together, but nothing.
That's wild.
I know.
So if they couldn't remember, how did this whole thing become so famous? Did they start having flashbacks or something?
This is where it gets even more interesting. They decided to see a psychiatrist, a pretty respected one named Dr. Benjamin Simon, to try to figure out what happened. And it was under hypnosis that both Barney and Betty started remembering bits and pieces of that lost time.
So let's talk about those memories. Betty's is the one that's usually talked about, right?
Yeah.
What did she remember under hypnosis?
So Betty described being taken aboard the craft. They were examined medically and even interacted with this leader who spoke English.
Wow, so they could understand each other.
Yeah, but here's the weird part. The details she remembered under hypnosis, they were different from the dreams she'd been having about it before.
You mean like before the hypnosis sessions?
Exactly. The way the beings looked, the technology, it wasn't a perfect match. Which is really strange when you think about how memory works, especially under hypnosis.
So even Betty's own memories had inconsistencies, which is fascinating. What about Barney? Did his memories line up with Betty's?
There were some overlaps, for sure. He also remembered being taken aboard and going through these medical procedures.
So like the same kind of stuff Betty described.
Yeah. But Barney's experience sounded a lot scarier. He said there was a language barrier and the communication was more like telepathy, which is kind of creepy if you think about it.
That definitely adds a whole other level to this story. Didn't he also say something about the being's eyes? Something pretty unsettling.
Oh yeah, he mentioned this terrifying detail about the being's eyes, like they were pressing against his stare. It's such a vivid image, and it really adds to the whole mystery and creepiness of the case.
So, okay, we've got these recovered memories,
Yeah.
but was there anything to back them up? Any physical evidence to support their story?
There were a few clues. A mysterious pink powder was found on Betty's dress, but it vanished when it was exposed to air.
What? That's so strange.
I know, right? And then there were those strange markings on their car that seemed to mess with a compass.
So, like, it was interfering with the Earth's magnetic field or something?
Yeah, it was pretty weird. None of this was absolute proof, of course, but it definitely added to the whole mystery.
And of course, we can't talk about the Hill case without mentioning that star map. That's the part that always gets everyone going.
Absolutely. Under hypnosis, Betty drew this diagram she said she saw on the craft. It wasn't until later that an amateur astronomer named Marjorie Fish looked at it and said it looked like the Zeta Reticuli star system.
Wow. So that's where the whole idea came from, that the beings might be from that specific star system.
It was a pretty bold claim, and it really got people talking. But it's important to remember that later research challenged Fish's interpretation.
Wait, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
What made her change her mind? Was there something specific that debunked her analysis?
It wasn't so much one specific thing that debunked it. It was more about how scientists looked at the whole thing. You see, when you're dealing with something as huge as alien contact, The evidence has to be super strong.
So it wasn't just the star map itself, but the methods used to try to prove it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something that often gets lost in all the excitement about these kinds of stories. It's easy to get caught up in the sensationalism, but it's important to remember that extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. And with the star map, that evidence just wasn't there.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So that brings us to the elephant in the room. The skeptics? Not everyone bought into the Hill story, did they?
Of course not. There were a lot of people who had other explanations for what happened.
Like what kind of explanations?
Well, some people said they might have just seen a normal aircraft beacon and mistaken it for something else.
Okay, so misidentification.
Right. Others thought maybe it was a combination of sleep deprivation and just their imaginations running wild.
And then there were those who said maybe it was because of what was on TV at the time, right?
Exactly. Remember, this was the early 1960s and science fiction was getting really popular.
So you're saying that what they saw on TV could have influenced their memories?
It's definitely possible. There was a show called The Outer Limits that had aliens with big black eyes, kind of like how the Hills described them.
Huh. So maybe some of that imagery from the show ended up in their memories.
Maybe, especially during those hypnosis sessions. Our minds are pretty amazing and suggestible, you know?
Yeah, I get that. It's not always easy to tell what we actually remember from what we've imagined or seen somewhere else, especially when it's something scary or amazing.
Exactly. So we've got misidentification, sleep deprivation, pop culture influences. Were there any other skeptical arguments that really stood out?
I'm curious to hear more about that and also about how the Hills themselves reacted to all the skepticism. We'll be right back after a quick break.
Well, some people took a more psychological approach. They said that the Hills might have had like a shared delusion or hallucination.
Even though they both seem so sure about what happened.
Yeah, it's a controversial idea, but it makes you think about how powerful the human mind can be.
Like how we can create these super vivid experiences even if nothing's really there.
Exactly, and it's not just with UFOs. We see it with all sorts of paranormal stuff.
Our minds are pretty wild sometimes. Right?
Yeah. They really are. Sometimes they can make things seem just as real as anything we experience in the physical world.
So what about the Hills themselves? I mean, with all this skepticism going around, did they ever back down from their story?
Nope, they stuck to their guns. They got ridiculed and doubted. People scrutinized them like crazy, but they never changed their minds. They were convinced that what happened that night was real.
It really makes you wonder what did happen to them. If it wasn't a misidentified beacon or a shared delusion, then what was it?
That's the big question, isn't it? That's what keeps this case so mysterious. It makes us question everything we think we know about the universe and where we fit in.
It's like their story became this test for how we see the possibility of alien life. Some people take it as proof, others see it as a warning about how our minds can play tricks on us.
Exactly. And that back and forth between belief and skepticism, that's what keeps us coming back to this case even after all these years.
Okay, so we've covered the basics of their encounter, the evidence, the argument against it. But what about the bigger picture? How did this whole thing change how we talk about UFOs and alien abduction? Did it just fade away, or did it leave a mark on our culture?
That's where the Hill incident really gets interesting. It's not just a story. It's like this cultural touchstone that has influenced everything from movies to how we search for alien life.
So you're saying it had a real impact?
Absolutely. It went from this small town event to something that captured the world's attention. I think it's partly because it tapped into these anxieties that were already there.
Anxieties? Like what kind of anxieties?
Well, think about the time period, the early 1960s. The Cold War was going on. The threat of nuclear war was very real. People were looking at the sky with both fear and fascination.
So it was like a really tense time.
It was. And the Hill incident with that mysterious craft and those strange beings, it played right into those feelings. It gave people a concrete image of the unknown.
It's like their story became a symbol of that era's worries, but also, in a way, it represented our hopes and fears about the universe.
Exactly. On one hand, it fed into our fears of being invaded or controlled by something we don't understand. But on the other hand, it also sparked this sense of wonder, a desire to connect with something bigger than ourselves.
It's like it gave people a peek into something both terrifying and exciting.
Exactly. It really blurred the lines between science fiction and reality. I mean, before the Hill case, alien abductions were mostly in comic books and cheesy movies.
Right. It was like entertainment, not something people took seriously.
Exactly. But the Hills were just normal people, respected members of their community. Their story, even though it seemed incredible, it felt real. And because they were brave enough to talk about it, to share their experience, even when people made fun of them, they paved the way for others to tell their stories too.
So their story gave others permission to speak up.
It did. It provided a framework, a way to understand these weird and scary experiences. The gray aliens with their big black eyes, the medical exams, the missing time, all of that became common in alien abduction stories. And it all goes back to the Hill case.
It's amazing how their story had this ripple effect.
Yeah.
They went through this bizarre and unsettling experience, and in doing so, they changed how we think about alien encounters even today.
It's really powerful. It shows how a single story can capture everyone's imagination and change how we see the world.
And it's not just the story itself. It's how the Hill incident connects to so many different fields like psychology, astronomy, sociology, even artificial intelligence.
You're right. It's like this intersection where science, culture, and the human mind all come together. It makes us grapple with huge questions about reality, our limits of perception, and the possibility of life beyond Earth.
Speaking of AI, I'm really curious about how it's being used in modern UFO research. I know we touched on it earlier, but it seems like such a high-tech approach to this ancient mystery.
It is, and it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. AI is all about recognizing patterns, analyzing tons of data, and finding things that we humans might miss. And that's exactly what we need for UFO research.
So instead of relying on what people say they saw or blurry pictures, we can use AI to look at radar data, satellite images, even sound recordings.
Precisely. We can give all that data to an AI system and let it do what it does best, find patterns, connections, anything that stands out.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
It's like we're finally using 21st century tools to tackle this mystery that's been around for decades.
It's a really exciting time to be involved in this field. And who knows, maybe AI will be the thing that finally helps us solve the mysteries of the Hill incident and other unexplained encounters.
It's wild to think that Barney and Betty Hill could have ever imagined that their story would one day be analyzed by artificial intelligence. So it's like something out of science fiction.
It definitely shows how far we've come in terms of technology. But even with all these advancements, the fundamental questions remain, are we alone in the universe? And if not, what does that mean for us?
Those are some big questions. And it seems like the Hill incident, even with all the controversy and debate around it, has really shaped how we approach those questions.
Absolutely. It's made us expand our thinking to consider possibilities outside of our everyday experiences. It's challenged us to be more open-minded, more critical, and more willing to consider the unknown.
So even if we never know for sure what happened to Barney and Betty Hill that night in 1961, their story has had a huge and lasting impact on our culture, our science, and maybe even our whole way of thinking about the universe and our place in it.
I think that sums it up perfectly. The Hill incident is more than just a UFO case. It's a reflection of our hopes, our fears, and our constant search to understand our place in the cosmos.
And sometimes the search itself is more important than finding the answer right.
I think you're right. The pursuit of knowledge, the willingness to ask tough questions, and the courage to face the unknown. Those are the things that make us human. And in that sense, the Hill incident, with all its complexity and mystery, reminds us what it means to be human in a universe full of wonders.
That's beautifully said. And on that note, we'll be right back to dive even deeper into the lasting impact of the Hill incident. Don't go anywhere. There's still so much more to explore. So we really dug into the Hill incident itself, looked at the evidence and what people said against it in the whole context of the time. But what gets me is how their story has just stayed with us. Like it started something, and from that we got all these alien abduction stories, pop culture stuff, even new ways of doing science.
I know what you mean. The Hill incident didn't happen in isolation. It became this jumping off point for so many other stories and investigations into UFOs.
So what are some ways the Hill incident changed pop culture? I can think of tons of movies and TV shows that seem to take inspiration from it.
Oh, for sure. Think about those classic gray aliens, the ones with the big black eyes, skinny bodies, and that super intelligent vibe. That image is everywhere now, and it comes straight from what Barney and Betty Hill described.
Right. And it's not just what they look like. It's the themes, too. The medical exams, the trouble communicating, the feeling of being watched. It's like all those things became standard in alien abduction stories.
Exactly. It's like they created a template for how we imagine meeting aliens. And that template's been used over and over, changed and reimagined so many times.
It's like they gave us the blueprint for alien encounters, and we've just been running with it ever since.
And it's not just in science fiction and entertainment. It's become part of how we think about these things. It shapes what we expect an alien encounter to be like, how it would feel, what it would mean.
It's interesting, too, how the Hill case happened at the same time that UFO research was becoming a thing. Before their story came out, people mostly thought UFO sightings were hoaxes or mistakes. But the Hill's account was so detailed and emotional, It made people take the whole thing more seriously.
You're so right. It legitimized UFO research in a way that hadn't happened before. It brought the conversation out in the open. And while there are still skeptics and lots of debate, at least it's not weird to talk about UFOs or the possibility of aliens anymore.
I think the Hill case also made people think about the bigger questions of alien contact. Like, if we ever actually met intelligent beings from another planet, how would we even talk to them? Would they be friendly? Could we all get along? Those are some heavy questions that the Hill incident kind of forced us to think about.
Totally. It made the whole idea of aliens feel much more real and immediate. And it raised all these ethical and philosophical problems that we still haven't really figured out.
It's like their story became this mirror where we see our own hopes and fears and beliefs. Some people see it as proof that aliens exist. Others see it as a reminder that we can't always trust what we think we see.
And that's why the Hill incident is still so captivating. It's a story that keeps changing, being reinterpreted and reexamined as we learn more about the universe and ourselves.
So to wrap things up, what do you think is the biggest lesson we learned from the Barney and Betty Hill incident? What's the main thing it leaves us with?
I think the most important thing is that we need to be open-minded. The universe is huge and mysterious, and there's so much we don't know. The Hill case reminds us to question what we think we know, to be willing to consider new ideas, and to be okay with not knowing everything.
And even if we never figure out exactly what happened to Barney and Betty Hill that night in 1961, their stories had a big impact on our culture, our science, and maybe even how we think about the universe and where we belong in it.
I agree. The Hill incident reminds us that sometimes the best stories are the ones that leave us with more questions than answers.
And that's a wrap on our deep dives into the fascinating world of UFOs and the enduring mystery of the Barney and Betty Hill abduction. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another exploration of the unknown.